Please welcome to the stage to deliver this morning's keynote address, Victor Madrigal-Borloz.
I pay my respects to elders past and present, to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Excellencies, distinguished attendees, dear friends, buenos dias, bonjour, good morning. 559 days ago, only a few hours after the Copenhagen World Pride Human Rights Conference wrapped up, my United Nations colleagues and I met with a then small Sydney World Pride team over a glass of wine. It took only a few moments for me to realize that our friends here had been dreaming already of every aspect of the frame in which we are meeting today. Dreaming hard. Over the last 559 days, they have made their dreams manifest in this extraordinary meeting that unites us today. A first for us in the Southern Hemisphere, and one during which we hope to reinforce our commitment to equality and to inclusion. Thank you, dear friends, for your extraordinary work. I was appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council 5 years ago to gather evidence on how violence and discrimination are perpetrated on lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and gender-diverse persons around the world on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, to analyze that evidence and to provide visibility to that analysis. Some of you may have heard me compare that work with fabric weaving. Every story, every image, every piece of evidence conveyed to me a thread that I need to decide how to carefully place in my loom. I draw inspiration from the historian weavers of the Huetar and Mayan peoples, ancestral rulers of the lands that I come from, to combine thread after thread in the hope that the pains of the past will become the source of the future's wisdom. I was therefore delighted to learn of the work on Indigenous language by Indigenous Australian researchers Angel Curry-Radley, Kylie Dowse, and Tess Ryan, through which they propose an ancestral understanding of weaving and jujarling, or talking, and dadiri, or deep listening, as method and cultural process as our individual strands weave together with collective ways of knowing, collective ways of being, and doing openly and freely. How delightful to hear that conception of weaving described as conceptual framework building in its most resonant form. Sadly, the first threads in my hands are often red, dripping with blood, or stained yellow from dry tears of unspeakable pain and suffering. I must use them. I cannot not do so because they are often given to me so that through them I can strive to speak truth to power. But as they reflect pain that might feel very close to many of us, they might be triggering for some of you survivors in the audience, so please understand that I strive to use them with great respect and with a sense of purpose. Dear friends, dignity and rights are the foundation of a theory of discrimination solidly entwined over the last 5 decades through international and regional human rights law. In 2017, in his inaugural address to the Human Rights Council, my predecessor, independent expert Muntaphorn, noted the connection of this historical process with this land through the seminal case of Tunen, in which, as related by His Excellency the Attorney General, in 1994 Australia was found in breach of the right to privacy due to criminalization of same-sex intimacy. Over the last 30 years, a robust body of jurisprudence and doctrine from the United Nations treaty bodies and the special procedures has shown that criminalization, pathologization, and stigmatization are all in breach of fundamental and international human rights obligations. As we are now in the Asia-Pacific region, we look forward to learn more about this, with so many countries that have at their core the concept of laws versus law, or cultural norms that are in themselves law in governing the daily lived realities of their communities. In 2019, at the ILGA World Conference in Wellington, I stood before many of you while we committed to working toward a world free of criminalization by 2030, a global call that was later complemented by my calls for a world free of practices of conversion and a world of legal recognition of gender identity based on self-identification. For those travails, the giants of international human rights law have given us, strategic litigants and advocates, the purple threads of equality and dignity. With those threads firmly tied up to the precedent of Tunen, you have gone to all corners of the world, and thanks to your tenacity, your conviction, and your sagacity, all LGBT plus persons living under the jurisdictions of Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Singapore, St. Kitts and Nevis, and other lands are no longer made criminals at birth. Sri Lanka, too, has announced that it will decriminalize, and legal recognition of gender identity is a reality in an array of countries. Until only a Wednesday ago, 350 million people lived already in systems of self-identification. That day, Spain, which just passed a law on self-attestation, added 47 million persons to that tally. The Spanish legislation also bans surgeries on intersex infants and children, reminding us to embroider purple circles in our fabric, and that without them, our movement will never be complete. Others among you have untangled the webs of pathologization, and during the last 2 years, awareness of the nature of practices of conversion has increased, and its nature as a form of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment has actually been deeply rooted in our awareness. Every day we hear reports of how our work to advocate for measures to end practices of conversion through regulations and laws and judicial rulings, and of course I am delighted that it is measures like this that are currently contemplated in the land that we are of, New South Wales. To all of you that are creating that change, we give you thanks. Dear friends, we converge, all of us, today in this hall for a reason. We hold blue threads of hope in our hands. What each one of us chooses to do with them over the next 3 days is vital for our siblings around the world. Our Australian friends have committed extraordinary efforts to promote inclusion and attendance in this hall is proof of their success. We recognize and we thank you. But we need to know that some who should be here are not here. Some remain in hiding or detained. Some lack access in economic, linguistic, or logistical terms. Many may not even imagine for many years that this powerful movement exists. In December 2019, at the Outright International Conference in New York, I shared my concern that some of us may have been propelled infinitely forward by the dynamics of respectability and privilege. But let us never forget that some of us are infinitely left behind without access to health, education, housing, or employment, and that it will be those that are left also wholly exposed to violence. In the 12 weeks after that conference, the pandemic gave us with a concrete example of that divide. Isolation, economic vulnerability, increased stress and exposure to domestic violence were some of the ways in which LGBTQAI+ persons felt differentiated and disproportionate impact of COVID-19 and pandemic-related response. The lessons learned from COVID are perfect examples of why we must not abandon our resolve to demand that states adopt all necessary measures to make operational the pledge of not leaving anybody behind, and in line with the human rights substantive, equality, non-discrimination that are embedded in the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. We must also redouble our efforts to end criminalization in the 67 countries in which it is still the law of the land. Criminal laws on abortion, sex work, and HIV transmission and non-disclosure have also discriminatory effects based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Without exception, successful decriminalization strategies have always relied on three basic principles. They have been driven locally, they have relied on context-specific strategic and tactical approaches to litigation, public policy, and law reform, and they have been the result of long-term understandings of legal convictions and social change rather than the language of coercive measures. First, we change the laws, then the rest will follow. That act of law reform, creating an environment of equality that fosters and nurtures the removal of discrimination, which in turn helps to change minds and attitudes towards and within our communities. Other challenges, dear friends, might be more elusive. According to consistent findings by my mandate, at the spike of every electoral cycle, in the Global South and Global North alone, media sectors cultivate the image of LGBTIQ+ persons as criminal, as antisocial, and as perverted. And they carve deep grooves between us and everyone else. We are fed to wide publics through processes that seek to galvanize political constituencies by eliciting easy moral outrage and a sense of moral panic. The result is the dehumanization of our communities through a loop in which it is irrelevant whether criminal charges exist. Our antisocial nature is implied. The resulting spiral of violence expresses itself through murder, sexual assault, stabbings, beatings, and kidnapping, and psychological violence, coercion and arbitrary deprivation of liberty, including forced psychiatric incarceration, bullying, and constant threats of violence and exclusion. all lead to depression, anxiety disorders, addiction, suicidal thoughts and attempts, and will contribute as well to symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. We know this reality if we think for a minute of the number of our queer siblings who encountered premature deaths. Think for how many of us being sexually or gender diverse has been the single most determinant fact in the pain that we work to overcome. And this is why I wish to recognize the pain and the strength of all survivors amongst us today. You have our respect. We will best address these challenges when we seek to understand how our political demands relate to wider social justice consideration, or let me actually correct that. We will only address adequately these challenges when we place our political demands at the service of wider social justice. And this is why I pay tribute to feminist thinking for that most extraordinary of contributions to our movements, the orange thread of intersectional approaches. I know that most asymmetries of power that affect LGBTIQ+ persons gravitate around intersections between sexual orientation and gender identity and race, migratory status, and national or social origin. At the 2022 ILGA World Conference in Los Angeles, Special Rapporteur Tendai Ashume reminded us that it is vital that advocates, lawmakers, that everybody turn to those on the front lines of living and fighting racial oppression as superior experts on what the priorities ought to be in the approaches and the nature of fighting that oppression and the execution of those strategies. Black and brown threads must therefore be placed in our loom, as Tendai also reminded us that condemning explicit prejudice must be accompanied by vigorous opposition to structures that facilitate racialized exclusion, as is the case of international migration law and so many national immigration policies around the world that are structured precisely to exclude Asian, Afro-descendant, Latin American, and Arab world persons in ways that simply are not the case for migrants from the global north. I remember clearly that the first day that I took up my mandate, I made myself the promise that it would be a feminist mandate. Today, I also know that it is equally essential that it be essentially an anti-racist mandate. I also hope that my mandate has provided our movement with useful evidence as to the importance of the inclusionary nature of non-discrimination. The ferocity of the attack against our trans and gender diverse siblings calls us to urgent reflection about the importance of restocking our white, pink, and light blue threads. We must stand firm in the understanding that exclusion of any of us immediately means the exclusion of all of us. In one of my travels throughout Latin America, I recently heard the testimony of a Latino trans man having escaped certain death in his village and made his way through deserts, jungles, and cities, sometimes crossing rivers tied up to a cord so as not to be carried by the currents, twice seeing a person next to him plummet to their death from a mountain ridge. Before leaving his friends, they had trained him on what to do when the certainty of rape would materialize, a training that he needed to use twice. As a result, he became pregnant, and while suffering a miscarriage, was expelled from the door of a local health center. "You make a travesty of nature," were the words that were spat in his face. For 3 days, he underwent the miscarriage by himself in a small tent. In the village where he remains today, after 3 thwarted attempts to seek asylum in a northern neighbor, being returned after each one under a third country assessment scheme. That certain politicians should work so hard as portraying asylum seekers such as this man as others, as not quite belonging to the same tribe that we must defend with every fiber of our being, is an excellent example of the observation of Darius Rejali in his seminal work on torture and democracy. He said, "The inexpressibility that matters politically is not the gap between the brain and the tongue, but between victims and their communities, a gap that is cynically calculated, a gap that shelters a state's legitimacy." Another urgent conversation that our movement will hold during the next few months relates to climate change. It's catastrophic and looming threat. Any social movement today that does not include climate change in its priorities is ubuesque. Despite the urgency of the climate crisis, little is known about the specific vulnerabilities of LGBTIQ+ persons and populations, and the absence of both a clear evidence base and a process for developing best practices for LGBTIQ+ persons. Issues related to climate change is of great concern, and I am very much hoping that soon I will receive the wisdom of our Pacific siblings to bring those to the forefront of our discourses. Dear friends, over time, the movement that supports our rights worldwide, many of whom are represented here today, have developed extraordinary capacities. They have created trust within and with the persons with lived experience, and they have developed the methodologies that ensure proper risk management and empowerment. They have crafted approaches that will ensure that through participation, the human rights interventions that they carry out will be relevant. They deeply understand what works in advocacy. Just look at how much has been achieved in terms of decriminalization and depathologization and legal recognition. These are also movements that are demanding that we acknowledge their capacity and their maturity. It's movements for which it's no longer valid to accept reliance on voluntarism when their members give up their expertise, and that their strategic and tactical capacities be recognized, that asymmetries in access between global north and global south be questioned and re-examined. Movements that demand that cooperation frameworks be themselves decolonized, and that green threads be placed only in the hands of those who add value. That is why, as I celebrate the creation of the Australian Fund for LGBTIQ+ persons, and I congratulate the Australian state for this extraordinary measure, I encourage states to follow suit and all states to ensure full participation of LGBTIQ+ communities and peoples in design, implementation, and evaluation of those facilities. I have witnessed far too many persons in our movement working under hardship and uncertainty, and I repeat here today that in a world in which many want to exterminate us, self-care is a political response for which we are responsible. I have also seen far too many organizations lose control of their research and intellectual property, too many victims losing control of their life stories. We must do better, and for those reasons, I'm also making a call for our movements, civil society, advocates, states, donors, and scholars alike, to commit to reflection about the ethical processes and frameworks that must guide the work in our field. And this is also because I am certain that this is one of our next frontiers, and I am sure that its development and its implementation will give us the edge over the laziness that is the trademark of bigoted and exclusionary narratives all over the world today. Faced with their self-indulgence and entitlement, let's renew our quest for excellence. Dear friends, I heard many moving stories during my recent visit to Cambodia last January, my second last as independent expert. One of them was conveyed to me by a 72-year-old trans man from the provinces. Starting in 1973, when they first met, He and his wife went through dozens of separations and reunions effectuated by their parents, their families, their communities, and state regimes, all based on incomprehension and prejudice. For the last few decades, they have been living together in a house built on a small patch of land that they cultivate and that provides their sustenance. The story conveyed to me tied together Cambodian and intimate history with the thread of one great conviction. We always knew that we would rather be dead than not loving each other, he said to me. Free and equal in dignity and rights, it's unfathomable that this most basic of propositions made in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these diminutive 28 characters in the English language and their correlative in myriad languages around the world, can encapsulate the constellations of suffering, courage, resilience, ingenuity, grief, and happiness that led that man to speak those words, and me to be in a position to listen to them. We hold on to those connections through our struggles because they are what reminds us that we were never not part of humanity and that we will never not be a part of humanity, that we share the same quest for love, dignity, and the freedom to be of service and to explore an understanding of our meaning. For the next 3 days, we have the chance of finding out what it is that we can create together, to explore our purpose. In that journey, I urge each one of you to listen deep, to speak kindly, and to dare to dream with others. In other words, let's weave industriously. Thank you very much.